Bro, a $1 trillion city in the desert sounds fake until you see the trucks. Haha, and not like one truck, like a whole truck civilization. That's what gets me. The scale is so absurd, it stops feeling theoretical. But then the obvious question hits, why build this at all? Because oil money is trying to turn itself into a future story. Basically, we have too much money, let's make geography. That is such a billionaire state impulse, it hurts. Saudi Arabia is not just building buildings, it is trying to build a new identity. And that is way more interesting than new city on paper. But paper is exactly where these things usually live for years. Until the desert starts eating the budget alive. Except here, the budget is already gigantic enough to scare people. The wild part is they are actually moving Earth on a huge scale. Like, when you see that many dump trucks, the fantasy gets real. The desert is getting audited by construction equipment. That is the best possible description of NEOM. And the roads are new too, which makes it feel like the map itself is being edited. That part is low-key creepy, because your phone does not even know where you are. Imagine building so fast that Google Maps becomes the lagging app. That is some future state arrogance right there. But there is also a real logic to it, because Saudi needs a post-oil economic engine. Right, like they cannot just keep betting everything on crude forever. Though, let's spend $1 trillion on one giant city is a very Saudi solution. Subtlety is not the brand here. They are using money as a signal, not just as capital. A signal to who? Investors? Tourists? Their own people? Honestly, all three, plus maybe the world. And that is why it feels like a national reinvention project. Which is always when the human cost gets slippery. Exactly, because the Bedouin story sits right underneath all this. Those are the people who actually know the land. Not from a presentation, from living there. Generations of survival in a place outsiders call empty. Which is always hilarious because empty to whom? To someone with air conditioning and a drone shot, apparently. And then you hear someone say they were born in a tent there. That changes the whole tone, because now this is home, not a blank canvas. And a lot of these mega projects act like home can just be moved aside. That part annoys me because progress gets used like a magic eraser. Wipe out the memory, build the road, brand the future. And then pretend the people who lived there were just scenery. Which is insane, because the whole place is literally built on their history. But I also get why some locals would want the jobs and the city life. Yeah, there is that split, because modern opportunity is tempting. One guy said he likes city work but still wants the Bedouin life. That is actually such a human answer. Nobody wants to be trapped in nostalgia, but nobody wants erasure either. That is the real tension, not just whether the skyline looks cool. And then there is the whole resort and luxury angle on top of it. Because of course a desert city also needs coastal resorts and mountain escapes. Nothing says future like extreme luxury with a climate problem. I mean, these projects always sell aspiration, but who is it for? Partly elites, partly global capital, partly a middle class they want to create, and partly the optics of, we are open for business now. Yeah, like, the city itself becomes a giant pitch deck. The most expensive PowerPoint in human history. But to be fair, they are not starting from zero. Because the oil state already has the centralized power to actually do this. Exactly. Most countries could not force this much coordination. That efficiency is impressive until you remember what it can override. Rights, consent, local messiness, all the inconvenient things. And that is why the project fascinates people and bothers them at the same time. Because it is not just a city, it is a bet on control. A bet that you can design society from the top down. which, historically, has gone amazing every single time. Yeah, no red flags there at all. But I keep coming back to the desert silence in the middle of all that machinery. That contrast is kind of the whole emotional argument. The night is peaceful, and then suddenly you have this industrial storm. And somehow both are happening in the same place. Which makes the project feel less like construction and more like a takeover, or a colonization of the landscape by ambition. That is harsh, but not unfair. The question is whether the new future can include the old people, because if it cannot, then it is not really a future for them. And if it fails financially, the whole thing becomes a monument to ego. The world's most expensive abandoned suburb. That is such a grim outcome, but not impossible. Still, I do not think this is pure vanity. There is real state anxiety underneath it. Every petrostate knows the clock is ticking on the old model. So instead of waiting, they are trying to build the next chapter by force, with dump trucks as the pen. And that is why people will keep obsessing over NEOM. Because it is never just about architecture. It is about who gets to define what a country becomes, and who gets left standing in the dust. That line is brutal, but it is the real one. Honestly, I want to know whether this becomes a model or a warning. Probably both, depending on which decade you ask. That is annoyingly the most realistic answer. Yeah, and that is why this thing is so hard to look away from. Because once you see the trucks, the whole thing stops being abstract. It becomes this insane physical fact sitting in the sand. Like, oh cool, they are actually moving mountains now. Not a metaphor, literally mountains. And that is what gets me, the confidence of it. Who looks at a desert and thinks, let us rearrange geology? Exactly, and not in a cute landscaping way. This is nation building with excavators. But that is also the point, right? They are trying to say the future is not elsewhere. It is here, and we are paying for it in oil money. Which is where I get stuck, because the bill is the whole story. $1 trillion is not a vibe, it is a spreadsheet with trauma. Spreadsheet with trauma is crazy, but yes. You can almost feel the state trying to buy a new identity. Not just roads and towers, but a different self-image. And those are much harder to build than roads, especially when the roads themselves are disappearing into nowhere. The Google Maps part is so funny to me. You are literally driving through blankness while construction happens around you. That blankness is the sales pitch and the problem, because blankness sounds like opportunity if you do not live there. And if you do live there, it can sound like erasure. That is the part people keep dodging when they talk about futuristic cities. Who was already on that land before the renderings showed up? Usually people with less power than the people drawing the lines. And then somehow they are framed as obstacles to progress. That is the oldest move in the book. The desert is never empty if somebody has lived through it for generations. It only looks empty from a boardroom. Damn, that is a brutal line. And the Bedouin angle matters so much here, because they are not just background characters in the story. They are the memory of what the place was before the megaproject, which is exactly why they make the project complicated. The future looks cleaner when the past is conveniently blurred out. Very efficient branding, very messy ethics. That should be on the investor deck. But I do think there is something psychologically real here. A state with huge resources eventually asks, what now? You cannot just keep being an oil bank forever. At some point, you want a second act. And if you are Saudi Arabia, the second act has to be visible. Not subtle, not incremental, just gigantic. They are basically saying, if we are changing, everyone will know. Which is also a power move, not just an economic move. Like, Look at us, we are not stuck in the old story. We can invent a new one at scale. The scale is doing a lot of the emotional labor. Emotional labor by a bulldozer is wild. Still, there is a real ambition there that you cannot laugh away. If it works, it changes how people imagine desert land. If it does not, it becomes the world's most expensive cautionary tale, which is a pretty good hostage situation for a country to be in. And then there is the weird human intimacy of the footage. The tea, the campfire, the camel meat, the quiet at night. That part makes the project feel less like a brochure. It reminds you the place is inhabited, not staged. Though honestly, the contrast is doing a lot of work. One minute you have a young guy offering camel meat, next minute megacity rhetoric. That is such a hard cut between worlds. And the coffee thing, weirdly, says a lot. The rhythm of the night is still local and human. The mega project has not swallowed that completely yet. Yet is doing a lot of work in that sentence. Because these projects tend to arrive with a promise of coexistence, and then suddenly coexistence becomes relocation, or compensation, which is such a cold word for displacement, especially when the thing being displaced is a whole way of life. That is why I keep coming back to the Bedouin families. They make the project morally legible in a way renderings never can. You cannot just Photoshop away a tribe. That line is outrageous, but true. And I think that is the tension that makes NEOM so fascinating. It is part vision board, part geopolitical flex, part social rupture. That is a very expensive trio. The world's most ambitious group project, with one person holding the remote. And that is probably why the criticism lands so hard. People are not just asking if it is beautiful or possible, they are asking who decides what counts as progress, and who has to disappear for progress to look clean. That is the ugly sentence underneath all the cool drone shots. But I also get why leaders love this kind of project. It is legible across the world without translation. Everyone understands a skyline, a road, a port, a resort. Everyone understands a bill, too, eventually, especially when it starts getting huge. The real question is whether this is infrastructure or theater. Maybe the annoying answer is both. Yeah, and maybe that is why it works as a story. It gives people something to dream about and something to fear. That is a powerful combination. Also, a slightly cursed combination. I keep thinking about that quiet night under the stars, because it is almost the opposite of the project's energy. One is ancient, patient, and human-sized. The other is all speed, machinery, and fantasy, and they are being forced into the same frame. That frame is doing a lot of heavy lifting, too. Maybe that is the deepest thing here. A country can be trying to outrun its own geography. Or maybe it is trying to reauthor it. That is the cleaner, more poetic version. The messier version is they are paving over history. And both versions can be true at once. That is what makes it such a good story and such a hard one. It is seductive, and then it is disturbing. Which is probably the most accurate description of modern mega-projects. Yeah, and probably of modern power, too. You build big enough, and people mistake scale for destiny. Maybe that is the whole trick. Make the future look inevitable before anyone gets to vote on it. That is bleak as hell. But also kind of the central move, yeah. And on that note, I think the quiet desert might actually be winning. For now, at least. For now, yeah, until the trucks show up and ruin the vibe. That part honestly got me, though, because the desert was already a whole civilization. And then you drop a megacity on it like the land was empty. Classic move. Ignore the people, admire the renderings. The renderings are always doing the most, too, like some sci-fi fever dream. But the real flex is the roads, the earth moving, the sheer machine of it. Right, that's what makes it feel less like a fantasy and more like a war on sand. A very expensive war on sand. And Saudi can actually pay for a lot of that because oil money is still absurd. But the whole point is, they do not want to stay oil-dependent forever. Sure, but building a trillion-dollar symbol is not the same as building an economy. You cannot just pave over the future and call it diversification. Although governments keep trying that exact energy. What makes NEOM fascinating is that it is part ambition, part national identity project. Like they are trying to say, we are not just a desert kingdom with oil. We are a place that can manufacture tomorrow. Which is a powerful sentence until you ask who gets moved for it. That is the part people cannot hand-wave away, the displacement and erasure. Bedouin life is not just a backdrop for a luxury brochure. Imagine being told your ancestral home is now a branding exercise. And meanwhile, the pitch is beaches, resorts, and mountain tourism. Like, okay, who exactly is this city for on day one? Billionaires, tourists, engineers, and basically nobody else at first? That is not a city. That is a very ambitious construction site. A construction site with better architecture and worse humility. Still, I get why they are doing it, because standing still feels like decline to them. If your whole region is changing, maybe you want to control the story. Even if the story is half dream, half intimidation. That is such a good line, actually. And the desert itself becomes propaganda in the process, which is wild. Because silence can look beautiful on camera while hiding all the trade-offs. Yeah, the empty frame always makes power feel cleaner than it is. But I do think that tension is why people keep watching this thing. It is ridiculous, but it is also a real test of whether money can bend geography, and whether a state can invent a future fast enough to outrun its past. That is the whole Saudi bet right there. Big, beautiful, unsettling, and impossible to look away from.